Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, our episode is a live recording at the Cheltenham Literature Festival a couple of weeks ago, where I was joined by Bruno, Maçães, and Sarah Wynn-Williams in front of a very large audience, and we were talking about who rules the world, Trump, tech, and the fight for the future. We are going to play you our recording of this event, and you will hear me introduce our speakers and their books. Each of them has recently published a book to our live audience. And you will also hear that one of them, Sarah Wynn-Williams, was speaking under unusual conditions. She was quite constrained. I hope I explain why in the introduction that you're about to hear, but I would encourage you, as I did when we were promoting this episode, though we're not, as you'll hear, really allowed to promote it. I would encourage you, if you want to know more, to Google Sarah Wynn-Williams and to Google her book. There is lots out there. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. It's also a recording of the podcast that I host, which is called Past, Present, Future. Let me introduce my two guests this evening. Bruno Maçães, who was a government minister in Portugal, is now a world-leading expert on technology and geopolitics. His latest book is called World Builders. And Sarah Wynn-Williams, who has both worked extensively inside big tech and studied it from the outside. Before we start, I have to say a little bit more about Sarah to provide some context for this event. Sarah published a book earlier this year that some of you may be aware of. It's called Careless People. It's highly recommended by me. However, it is the story of her time working in a senior role at Meta, formerly known as Facebook, and Meta, formerly known as Facebook, took exception to Sarah's book, and they managed to get a gagging order in the United States which prevents Sarah from talking about or publicizing her book. And that is still in place, which means that this evening we are going to be talking about a subject, but there are some areas that Sarah will not be able to go to. It's an unusual gagging order in that she is allowed to say positive things about Meta and the people who work there, including Mark Zuckerberg, although saying that Mark Zuckerberg works at Meta is a bit like saying God works at heaven or the devil works at hell. It's his place, but she is not allowed to say anything negative. And she is not allowed to talk about her book. She is also not allowed to sign copies of her book afterwards. Bruno and I can sign copies of Sarah's book, but she can't. So that is the context. Those are the conditions under which we are having this conversation. It is somewhat unusual, I have to say. There may be moments where Sarah's silence is eloquent. The title of this session, Who Rules the World? Trump, Tech, and the Fight for the Future. We will get on to Donald Trump. We're all allowed to talk about him for the moment. But I want to start actually with the fight for the future. And just to set some context, we're going to be talking about some very big themes. Bruno, if I had to ask you where the battleground is in the fight for the future, so if we're talking about the big contests going on in our world, political contests, but also fights over technology, AI, the geopolitical contests that are going to shape the future, what is the battleground? Where is this fight happening?
Yeah, it's a good thing to put the question that sharply. I'm a writer of geopolitics. I am also someone who thinks that that's the most important question today, that provides the framework for everything else. So I would have to answer the battle between China and the United States to decide who will shape the general architecture of the global system is more important than anything else, more important than anything happening inside our borders, inside our countries, more important than the battle that I think is relatively imaginary between humanity and AI, or even the battle between oligarchs and the people. I think more important than all that is China and the US.
And just to clarify, when you say essentially to set the terms on which the future is going to be decided, what kind of space are we talking about? Is this a fight which is happening in what we used to call cyberspace, or is it a fight that is happening in what I think we still think of as the real world?
It's happening everywhere. Today we have something we could call the American world or the American system. I remember in 2018 in Washington, when I went there, I heard a lot the expression, if we're not careful, we'll be living in a Chinese world. And it's an expression that made me think, what is this idea that the world can be Chinese or American? So it's a profound battle in the sense that it will essentially shape the world we live in. Our worlds are now so artificial, so constructed, so built, so technological, that in fact China and the United States, perhaps India playing a part in that battle, will decide the kind of world we live in.
Sarah, where do you think the battleground is in the fight for the future?
I agree with the identification of the actors. And I think, given the title of the session, I think it's going to come down to AI in this next decade, basically. I think it's around trying to have an operating system as much as who sets the framework for the technology that will define the next decade.
And is that operating system something that's going to be set and decided by the technology companies? Is it going to be set and decided by governments? Could it be set and decided by international institutions? How is the fight going to be decided?
Who rules the world? Is it the tech companies, the tech oligarchs, the big tech CEOs, or is it still states and politicians? And I think very strongly still states and politicians. And it's precisely in moments of crisis, particularly this moment now, where we have the onset of an all-out technology and trade war between the United States and China, that it becomes very obvious that states are still in charge. If you Google that famous picture during Donald Trump's inauguration, where in the first row you have all the tech CEOs, Amazon, Meta, Google, Elon Musk with his companies. But I think it was a demonstration that they were there at Trump's inauguration, and they were witnessing, and they were clapping, and they were praising and flattering Trump nonstop. Because in the end, Trump can decide whether these companies thrive or don't thrive. It's not just because I write of geopolitics. I think the evidence in the last year is clearly that states are in charge.
And what do states have that these companies are afraid of? So what is the threat that they have hanging over them?
Well, I actually want to disagree with Bruno, because I think there are two different models, and I think that's part of what makes this competition so interesting. So I think a month ago, it nearly got through a resolution in the Senate that would have prevented any regulation of artificial intelligence for the next decade. So that's effectively removing the state from the development of technology, because the way that states interact with technology is through regulation. So this moratorium, which, but for Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee and the power of the country music lobby, we would be in a world where there was a moratorium on regulation. Compare that to the Chinese model, which is an incredibly regulated, where the state plays an incredibly large role. And maybe a week ago, there was an announcement that Huawei and DeepSeek had collaborated on a safe AI model that was effective in removing nearly 100% of politically sensitive discussions. And that is the state setting the terms for that technology. So we have a competition between two completely different models. And to your third point of are there overarching roles? I think a real missed opportunity so far is the role of multilateralism in this, in terms of potentially developing norms and frameworks. And instead we're having this dueling approach of the interrelationship between state and technology.
So what feels to me like the thing that makes thinking about the future so complicated is, in a way, we can see the battle lines, but they cut across each other. And as Sarah just described it, so you can see a world which is in some ways a recognizable new Cold War world, which is the China-United States conflict, and some of it plays out in ways that are familiar over territory and over influence over other governments and other territories. And then within each system, there's another contest that's going on, which is between the state, the power of politicians, and the technology companies themselves. And then each of those contests is different too. And some are trying within that to identify where the essence of this fight is going to be won or lost. So it could, in a way, be won or lost in any of those dimensions. Something could happen in that contest in China that fundamentally changes it, or in the United States. So to Sarah's point, Bruno, if you look at the way, and you have experience of this, if you look at the way that big tech relates to politics and politicians in China and the United States, are we looking at, if one or other of these systems wins, a completely different kind of world and relationship with technology? Say we were living in the Chinese world, would we notice a very different way in which power of big tech operated?
Yes. Now, I'm not saying that tech companies and tech CEOs don't have a lot of power. They do have a lot of power. They try to control or influence the state, but they have to compete with other interest groups. In the United States, I think we're seeing now the beginning of a competition between the MAGA movement and the tech movement, and they have different goals. For example, on questions of visas, for Indian engineers, the tech world would like one solution. The MAGA movement would like a completely opposite solution. And this happens in every system. In China, you have your own balance of interests. It's very different. Clearly, the tech companies are less influential. That is true. My own experience living in China, and sometimes I was invited to these big banquets. I had just written a book on China. I don't know if now in the UK saying that you were invited to these banquets raises questions in the current environment. And I could see that the relationship of power was very different from what you could see in the US. If sort of a mid-level party official, if the party leader in a Chinese city, not even a top national leader, was in the banquet, a tech CEO would defer to him, would come to his seat at the table and shake his hand. In the US would be exactly the opposite dynamic, that the governor of a state would defer to Elon Musk. And you could see, you know this immediately, when the big shot enters the room, everyone looks and everyone stands at attention. And in China, it's the party officials, it's not the tech CEOs. So this is one instance where the world we'll be living in will be very different whether an American model or a Chinese model ends up winning in the end.
So can I ask you about Elon Musk, because we are allowed to talk about him, right? What do you think the last year has taught us about that power balance in the United States between the most powerful tech companies? I mean, Musk is not just tech, right? He also makes cars. But I think a lot of the hopes that are invested in him by investors are to do with a future that he hasn't invented yet. His relationship with Donald Trump and the way in which it seems to have ended, what does that tell us about that dynamic between tech power and political power? I want to come on to the question of Musk and his wider role in the world, including in this country. But when you look at that, there was a moment where it looked like, in a way, Musk was an arm of the government, and it was very brief. What did we learn?
It was a brief moment in time, but it's had an incredible legacy. I mean, I think it shaped so much of the congressional response to the Trump administration. Just having the threat of Musk's money being piled into whoever opposed Trump. Now that he's departed stage left, that dynamic still remains, even though Musk has been removed from the equation. That sense of you either are silent or you get on board with this administration's agenda because of the threat that you'd be primaried or your opponent's PAC was going to swell through Musk. It's incredible that we've stayed with that despite that money not even materializing in many instances, or if you look at the Wisconsin race, not being successful. And yet the pattern that was set at the start of the administration has held. I think that's incredibly mysterious.
You know, I see these events as essentially after Trump came back to the White House, Musk tried to take over the state, tried to take over the government. It was in fact a bit of a Lenin-esque moment where you have someone coming from outside the system that tries to take over the system, probably thinking that Trump could be manipulated, influenced, flattered, bought, and so on. But it failed. It completely failed. And it failed because Musk is not a Lenin, and probably because the American system was not that vulnerable to a kind of an outside attack of this kind. Musk had to retreat. He had to apologize. Recently, during the Charlie Kirk ceremony, it took place in a football stadium, you could see that Musk went up to the presidential seat and kind of apologized to Trump, and Trump said, okay, I know you wanted to talk to me. This was captured on tape. You wanted to talk to me. Let's make up. But it was humbling for Musk. And now I think he's retreated to the role of influencing the government rather than taking over the government. But that's a completely different role.
And how much of it is, to use a category which is familiar from the world we're in now, never mind the world we're about to enter, how much of it is just about money? So something I think a lot of people struggle with, and I struggle with, is just to know what to think about wealth on this scale. So the thing that really struck me when Musk tried to intervene in British politics at the Unite the Kingdom march that happened a short while ago in London, and he was beamed in, essentially to tell the people there not to overthrow, but to reject their government that had been elected into office barely more than a year before. In the 2 days before Musk appeared on that screen in Trafalgar Square, his personal net worth went up by £30 billion because of the gyrations in the Tesla share price. So £30 billion is the so-called black hole in Britain's public finances that has paralyzed the government for the past year. And even now, as we speak, has Rachel Reeves lying awake at night thinking about how she could possibly manage a system which has a £30 billion black hole in it. So one man's net worth in 2 days versus the British government's fiscal position over a parliament. I don't know how to think about a world in which those two things collide. Help me.
Well, part of the issue is that Britain is now a small country and relatively broke. Not as broke as others, but I don't think it's about money. I think it's actually about the things that money can't buy. It's political power.
Right, but that is money. I mean, money is not valuable because it's money. It's valuable because of what it can buy.
Yes, but Musk, from his position as a businessman, can influence policy, but he cannot legislate, and he cannot take the American government in the direction he wants to take it. For example, to realize his dreams, his personal dreams of going to Mars, of creating these interfaces between the brain and computers, and so on and so forth. These are the sort of dreams that I think he realized 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe a little more. You can only realize these dreams if you're in charge of the American government. You can't realize as the CEO of very large companies. Because, by the way, you need to define the regulatory environment and the political environment, and you have to have control over America's defense budget, and so on and so forth. I think that's when he said, if I want to realize these dreams, I need to take over the government in some form.
I mean, I think this is where this government especially, but governments more generally, need to remember who they are.
And by this government, you mean the UK?
Yes. And I think, again, looking at those two models and looking at how China has managed the question of the power of tech companies. I mean, it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when China decided to take a massive hit when, Jack Ma disappeared, and, they made some very, very difficult decisions getting out of consumer-facing technology more into solar. And again, there's a lot that can be questioned there, but there's not a fear of power is about what other people believe. You can look at this at a macro level and you can say a lot of what is happening is that people are making decisions out of fear of a rising China. People are making decisions out of a fear of technology. And in that, they are ceding the power they have. And I think it would do governments well to remember that they are representatives of the people. And yes, there is a fiscal black hole, but this is still an incredibly rich country that has power that it seems to have forgotten about when it's dealing with tech companies.
So are you saying that in a way, take the British government, that we are, I say we, they, we, as a nation, we are frightened of the future in ways that we probably don't need to be, that there's a sense in which the thought of this future that we've partly described here, a Chinese-American contest to set the terms on which the world is going to exist, that has a kind of paralyzing effect on governments like ours?
I think it's important to remember that there are swing votes in that, India, Brazil, UK, Europe. There's a whole system to be played for, and there is power in that fight that seems to have been forgotten.
Bruno, do you think that in this China-American contest we're in danger of forgetting about everyone else?
Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about the general architecture of the global system, the most important structures that in a way define everything else, down from that, it's the big actors. But that still leaves some space for national democracies and their own compromises and trade-offs. I just came back from Singapore, and we had a big discussion there with members of government and think tankers and so on about, is it going to be a bipolar world or a multipolar world? And to my relative surprise, everyone in the room seemed to assume the race is between 2.5 countries, China, the United States, and the third one that could get into the competition turns out at this point to be India. And you never hear any talk about the European Union or Russia as being part of this competition. 10 years ago, people would have talked about 4 main powers: US, China, EU, and Russia. And now somehow this has changed. It's changing very fast. That's what I realized in this discussion. Just a few years, we have changed our mind about what the fundamental global competition is about.
It is sometimes said, there's a book that has made this case particularly, that if you think of that contest between China and the United States, and maybe you could include other parts of the world in that too, one way to frame it is that China is a country run by engineers. That's how it's sometimes put. I think the version of this argument 10 or 15 years ago was that the West was run by economists, but economists haven't had a good run of it. And now the view is that we live in a world run by lawyers. Our Prime Minister is definitely a lawyer. Is that a useful or fair way to characterize what's going on here? Do you think this is actually partly about two systems, one of which has in charge people who, to a greater or lesser extent, actually understand the engineering of the technology that we're talking about, and the other system is run by people who only know the legal version?
I disagree with that idea. I would frame it differently. I would say Western societies, and particularly the United States, is not run by lawyers. It's run by Instagram and Twitter influencers. And China is not run by engineers. China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very ideological, very political, collective organization of 90 million people spread all over the country. And the fact that China has so many engineers is not kind of a miracle. It is a result of policy choices that were made by the Chinese Communist Party over 4 or 5 decades of investing in these schools, in this training, of turning engineering into a national priority. But it's not engineers running it. Engineers didn't create themselves.
So it is the Chinese Communist Party running China, but the people who reach the top of the Chinese Communist Party, the very top, the Politburo, are engineers. And that seems like a significant difference. If you look at the very upper echelons of these two, the number of people in senior positions in the United States who went to law school, particularly Harvard or Yale Law School, relative to the number of people in the most senior positions in China who have an education, a training in engineering. Leaving aside the ideology, that is a stark difference.
Yeah, and it's been getting more and more like that. The latest Politburo, it's a big change from the previous one. Now, I can tell you very quickly why I think that's the case. China wants to rule the world, and in order to rule the world, they looked at the past, last 500 years. Who are the countries that rule the world? Are the countries that have the fundamental breakthroughs in technology, particularly in energy and in technology. So if we want to take the role that the United Kingdom took in the 18th century and the United States in the 19th century, we have to do the same. And for that, we need engineers.
And I recently flew to Mongolia, and in doing that, flew over mainland China. And just seeing the scale of the solar, there were solar panels in places that seemed impossible to get a solar panel, like tops of mountain ranges in the most unexpected, like middle of the desert, huge, ambitious installations. And a lifetime ago, I worked on governance in Antarctica. Weird segue, but again, China was building places in Antarctica that people were like, you could never have any kind of human life sustained there, and that was taken as a challenge. So I think there's this ambition and growth, and this sense of an opportunity provided by technology, very focused on climate and energy, which again is related to, how do you power data centers? How do you get the infrastructure? How do you get the nuts and bolts of it working? And then you come to this government and you can't agree on HS2. And the difference is stark.
I mean, it's a flight over a country, but looking down, did you think they're winning?
It's hard not to be blown away at the scale and how rapidly that has changed. In another context, so one of the things that I've worked on over the last few years, negotiations between the US and China on integration of artificial intelligence into weapons. And in that context, it would be understating things to say that China is on the cutting edge.
China in 2024, we still don't have the final figures for 2025. In 2024, installed as many solar panels as the United States, not in 2024, not in the last 5 years, as the United States in all its history. So in 1 year, China installed as many panels as the United States in all its history. Now, I happen to believe that solar is the energy of the future, simply because 99% of the energy that reaches the Earth comes from the sun. And fossil fuels are kind of a deferred form of solar energy. Why not get it at the source? For AI, you're going to need solar energy. The US is now heading towards a big political problem of how to distribute the limited, scarce energy resources that the US has. It either goes to AI and to data centers, or goes to the common citizen to warm their houses. I think this problem is going to arise very, very soon in the American debate. I think China is making the right choice of investing in solar. Sometimes in the US, when I visit, I hear the opinion, particularly in the Republican Party, that solar energy is too feminine. I guess because it doesn't make loud noises and it doesn't explode. But if this is the attitude with which the American system is making fundamental decisions, it doesn't look promising.
Yeah, that is a losing ticket. So I want to ask you now about AI, and I just want to pick up on a phrase you used there, Sarah. I want to talk more broadly about AI, but specifically, because it's quite a dry phrase, but when you think about it, it's completely terrifying, which is the integration of AI into weapon systems. What are we actually talking about there? Is it as scary as it sounds when you think about it?
It's worse. Yeah. So perhaps a decade ago, there might have been an opportunity for everyone to agree that there should be a ban on autonomous weapons that can kill people, right? And I think that feels like something that it should be easy to get consensus on. There is no consensus on that, and there are no rules. So at the moment, not only are you having this technological race to develop the underlying technology, it's being integrated into things that will have the ability to decide whether people live or die without a human being in the loop of that decision. So it's on the weapons level, but it's also on the systems level. We don't have any rules. Like, should we agree that you cannot poison the data that will be used in weapons, in weapons making decisions? Should we agree that all weapons, that we should have geolocation? We should agree that you shouldn't be able to program weapons to attack, say, hospitals or water grids? Should we agree that there should be country of origin markings on weapons so we know where they've come from or whether they've fallen into third? There are no rules on any of this. At the same time as the capability and sophistication of these weapons it's no exaggeration to say that is improving day by day.
Should we think of it as a literal arms race, this? So at the AI level?
Palantir CEO says, and I think he's right about this, that AI in warfare is as powerful as nuclear weapons, with the difference that it can actually be used because it is so selective. You can destroy a whole army in 10 or 20 minutes using this technology, but it is more selective, although in Gaza it hasn't been particularly selective, but we know that it's been used in Gaza, some of these platforms. It's much less visible than nuclear power. It will be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to get the major states to agree on any limits and constraints. Thankfully, they agreed when it came to nuclear. There still exists a kind of international framework of rules and understandings. I don't think there will be when it comes to AI. We've seen it in Ukraine. We've seen it in Israel. I think the moment when we're really going to see, and we're going to be blown away by what we see, is in the case of Taiwan, if there is a conflict between China and the US.
I mean, one of the things when we're talking about, the power between state and technology companies, one of the things that always used to give me some comfort was the distinction that as powerful as some of these tech companies are, the difference between them and a state is that states have force, they have armies. We're past that distinction now. AI from these tech companies is being integrated into the Department of Defense in the US. PLA has explained some of the ways that they're using AI. And so that firm distinction that maybe provided comfort for a decade has gone.
So does that then reverse the balance that you described at the beginning? Because there is a dependency now. States have things that companies don't have. The two main tools that they have that companies don't have is an army and a currency. These companies have tried to create a currency at various points, and they
and are still trying.
And they have pseudo-currencies.
And crypto is so central to this administration in the US.
But nonetheless, I think we're still in a world where if the dollar collapses, it's bad news, even for the biggest tech companies. But the balance is starting to shift. So those two key advantages. Is the dependency moving the other way, as Sarah described, if actually the US Department of Defense is dependent on this technology for the basics of warfare?
I'll apologize for being so stubborn. I don't think so. I think those are examples of how states are still in charge. When a certain company decided to create a currency, it was immediately shut down. And in fact, I think that company was surprised by the blowback coming from states.
And this is Meta trying to create Libra.
Trying to create Libra. And I think they were surprised, they were relatively shocked, but they also felt immediately powerless. And then when it comes to AI warfare and a company like Palantir, my first visit almost 10 years ago to Palantir, they made it very clear, and they were very interested in talking about that to everyone, that they would never work with Russia, Iran, or any country that could at any point become an adversary of the United States. Now, if this was a company operating in a completely free way and owner of its own destiny, it would be concerned about money, about expanding, would work with everyone. But I think they realized, and it was smart of them, that if they were too flexible on these things, again, they would suffer the impact from the power of the American state. So from the very beginning, they worked closely with the Pentagon, closely with the American state, because they know, as an American company, that's what you have to do. Otherwise, you're going to suffer the consequences. I see the power of the state still there, promoting these companies, working with them, sometimes sort of disguising the connection because it's not good if it's too apparent, but it is a close connection.
So I want to come on to Trump, but one more question about AI. The other phrase that's being used a lot at the moment is that we're in an AI bubble, particularly in relation to asset values and stock markets and so on. But more broadly, there is a kind of almost hysterical hype around AI at the moment because the pace of change is so rapid, but also a feeling that the company, not the nation, but the company that captures some plausible version of artificial general intelligence first wins the game. It's almost like a game in which the first mover maybe gets the whole board. Is that what's driving it? It's my first question. And my second question is that remotely plausible? That some company might win this?
So on your first question, I think the scale of investment is incredible, and the gap between the capex and revenue is very sobering. The Apollo project over 10 years, I think, was inflation adjusted like $300 billion over 10 years. that equivalent needs to be spent in 10 months. You're going to have to have a get us to the moon style project investment every 10 months to get the same sort of scale. So I think it really is an incredible amount of money, and I don't think people understand the sort of scale and how little revenue is coming in. And also, it's not clear to me that people even know how to be creative with these products. And to your second point about winner takes all, it's also not clear to me what the moat of these companies are. Like, I can tell you the difference between using Claude or GPT-5 or DeepSeek or Quinn, but I don't know in and of itself whether there's enough of a moat around each of those products that there is a winner-take-all within that.
So by a moat, you mean these things would be protected from all of the others?
Or that someone builds out that you have one product that wins across everything else, network effect supply, and there's a moat that keeps out all other competitors.
But is the thought not, so at the moment they are kind of samey, so as a sort of civilian user of these products, I can't really tell the difference. I have DeepSeek on my phone, seems all right. Some things it can't do, some things it can do. But that there will come a point where one of these companies finds a version of this thing that we're calling AI, which can do things that just put it in a different league from the others. And the minute that that happens, all of the money in the world, is the belief, starts to gather around this product. Is that a plausible version of the future?
I don't think so. So this is now what everyone is talking about. Do we have an AI bubble? Is it going to burst? Is it going to collapse the stock market in the US and perhaps in the UK? Is there going to be a financial crisis in the UK? And so on. Many questions are raised. This industry is sucking in all the capital from other industries. It's now responsible for 40% of American GDP growth, the investment in AI and data centers. Where are the revenue streams? We had been promised a complete transformation of our economies. I don't think the tech people understand that unless they take over the government, we go back to the beginning of our conversation, you cannot transform our whole economies overnight. So if that's the premise, it's wrong. Yesterday, Sam Altman announced that these AI bots will now be able to create homemade erotica. And, that's great news to all of us, but it's a dream come true. But, I know erotica is a big industry, but it's not an industry justifying trillions and trillions in investment, which is what's happening with AI. Now, when I say this, people call me old-fashioned. But, their premise is that they are going to develop very soon, they say it's in 2026, 2027 at the latest, superintelligence, superhuman intelligence at your disposal in a little box. We'll soon know.
It is one of the ironies of this story, which is that this vision of the future that we're being sold, this transformative vision of the future, when you push these companies as to how they are going to make money, it is advertising and pornography that lies at the basis of this. I mean, they are, in a way, still advertising and pornography companies.
Well, some of them have done very well out of that.
Yeah, but it's not a brave new world. I mean, if you do advertising really well and capture a market, if you do pornography really well and capture a market, you're going to make a lot of money. You are not going to invent the future.
That's why I think it's revealing that Sam Altman 2 years ago talked a lot about robots and now talks about erotica. I think we're heading in the direction of having a sort of hyper-internet, hooking us in even more than the internet did for the purposes of advertising and erotica.
We have mentioned him, but we've done pretty well in avoiding talking about Donald Trump. But he also, in the same way that these companies suck in all the capital, he sucks in the world's attention in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. Never mind any politician do, but almost anyone do. I read the New York Times, and every day is a little game. I just count the number of stories that have Trump in the title. And it is mind-blowing. And yet, given some of the things that we've been talking about, some of the more structural contests that are going on, what's happening in China, is it a sideshow? I mean, assuming that he's not going to run again, there are 3 more years of this. Are these 3 years and what the Trump presidency might do decisive for the shape of the future world we're going to inhabit? Or should we already be weaning ourselves off the attention that this man sucks out of us and think about the real questions?
Well, that's why I said the world is ruled by Instagram and Twitter influencers, and Donald Trump is one of them. But he's been very successful at this. It's his style. It's not a lawyerly style, by the way.
No, he's not a lawyer.
I think he should get the Nobel Prize, not the Peace Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Prize in Literature. No, I mean that honestly. He has changed political discourse forever. More than Churchill did. Churchill didn't change political discourse, and he got a Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, the question as I see it is this. Donald Trump has a different conception of American power, much more direct, much more brutal, not exercised through structures or systems, but exercised face-to-face. It's not transactional, as opposed to what I hear all the time. It's extractive. He doesn't negotiate deals. He tries to extract something using leverage, blackmail, threats, and so on. So it's much worse than transactional. I would really wish people stopped saying transactional. It makes it sound better than it is. Is this going to succeed or no? My own opinion is that it will succeed at first. It is succeeding. He is extracting a lot of money, a lot of value from Europe and transferring it directly to the US budget. But I think in the medium long term, it will be destructive of American power. American power worked so well over 70 or 100 years precisely because it was structural, systemic, because it was not in your face, because you worked through structure, so the way the world works rather than being a direct, brutal kind of power.
I think you see the two things we've been talking about in this session coming together. One is a series of companies that have undermined our ability to sustain attention on anything or have changed how we think about attention. And then a politician who has played precisely into that, in part because he mastered what is now X and what used to be Twitter. He is a politician of that outrage, that text, and that scroll through, see the next thing. And it's hard to see what happens with attention from here. It's hard to see whether the politicians that follow him will mimic that, grab attention, do the next thing, overwhelm, or whether we'll return to the mode of politics that existed beforehand. And it's hard to see where this new technology, what role is AI going to play in the analysis of attention and how it sustains our attention.
The impression that I get from what you have both just described is that if you were put on the spot now and had to say who was winning the fight for the future, you don't think it's the big technology companies, but you think it might be China.
I think it's still open. I like to think about geopolitics as a game. And in a game, I have no problem saying that at present, in this moment, China is having a better period. But it's a game and things could change tomorrow, next year. Sometimes they change very dramatically and radically. And I don't think we can know before the end. I always resist because if it is a game, it's open until the end.
But what is the end of the game?
There will be a moment when one of the sides will have overwhelming power over the other. By the way, I don't think the US has overwhelming power over China. That's been one of the revelations of the year, that when Donald Trump thought he could coerce China into accepting certain decisions, he realized, and is realizing now, you can hear the tone is quite desperate in Washington, that they realize that China already, if you talk in percentages, China already controls 30% of the global system. And the US, maybe 65%, and the rest of 5%. There's never a final end, but if China does turn this around, then you can say it has decisively won the battle that is ongoing now. But we don't know if it will be able to do that.
In the way that the United States won the 20th century.
Yeah. So they're battles that correspond to centuries.
I can tell you what I don't want the end to be, which is technology is notoriously buggy, and someone decides to integrate AI into second strike capability in the South China Sea and does it badly, because
that's the end of everything.
That is the end.
We always like to end on a cheerful note.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, if I may. One of the things that I noticed is how very technocentric the discussion is, and I understand that's the topic that we're discussing. However, one of the things we also need to remember is huge swathes of the world and population don't have access to the energy or the technology on which this argument is based. And the hearts and minds aspect, I think, and I would welcome your views on this, the Chinese are doing in spades, investing across Africa and South America. Your views?
One of the things, part of the reason I raised Antarctica is that one of the things that has been striking to me is the extent to which China is willing to invest and how disciplined they are in the actual rules and governance. So the United Nations body that governs a lot of technology issues is called the ITU. I challenge anyone in this audience to sit through a day-long ITU meeting because they are incredibly technical. But, China has been amazingly disciplined at showing up at the most local level ITU meetings across Africa, across Asia. They had a Chinese leader of the ITU organization. And there is that sense of really investing in the frameworks, not just in China, but, along with Belt and Road, like investing in the governance and at the most local, it's like the equivalent of going to your council meeting, because there's a sense of a long-term payoff and in setting the rules and framework for the technology that is to come.
I think hearts and minds are very important, but even the battle for the hearts and minds has a technological side, an element that is very important. China is improving its soft power in part because people now regard China as technologically advanced and in some areas more advanced than the West. As people visit Chinese cities, they come back impressed, they tell their friends. So this is part of the battle of the future, which I think, again, the United States is not playing it particularly well. USAID, this very large budget that US used to conquer hearts and minds worldwide has been mostly canceled. I think it's already having a significant impact across the world from what I hear in my travels. But again, the game is on, and I hope at some point the US will realize that this approach is not working and go back to investing in the world, to have a positive vision, invest in infrastructure in different parts of the world, and so on and so forth.
Do you think, given it's partly a reputational game, that reputations can be recovered that quickly? I mean, they say a reputation takes a lifetime to build, but you can lose it overnight. Do you think that can happen to a country or indeed a political system?
Yeah, what is remarkable about the present moment is that over the past few months, let's say the past year, China seems to be winning the PR battle, but it's winning the PR battle playing in America's home field because the global media is controlled by US outlets. All this is happening in English, not in Mandarin. So as this also changes, as China gets better at projecting its own media, as Mandarin becomes more common, it will become more and more difficult for the United States to win the soft power battle. But for the time being, America does have that advantage.
Thank you. So thinking back in Chinese history, recent history, we had Deng Xiaoping, who seemed to have a slightly different approach to communism. What do you think will happen when Xi Jinping dies? Will it change things?
One of the things that I think she has always had an eye to is legacy and control. And I anticipate, and again, it's very hard to see that far, I anticipate that this is being rigorously planned and considered and succession. But we don't know the world that the next leader will enter into.
I think we might have a leader that is smoother, more cosmopolitan, will appeal more to global public opinion. There's a huge generational change happening in China. I didn't go to China from 2020 to 2023 because of COVID. And when I went back, the differences were enormous in the sense that that generation coming from poverty and the Cultural Revolution is now disappearing, going to retirement. And you have a new generation that is much more open, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, even if they don't speak English. And I think the leadership is probably going to change in that direction. I think 10 years from now, it will be unrecognizable what the Chinese president will be. He will be trying to charm the world. He will be smiling. Maybe he'll have a smattering of English. That, I think, is almost inevitable.
And it is worth saying, in the difference between these two systems, we don't, in our system, have to wait for the leader to die to know who the successor will be. Although I should say that the person I most trust on American politics, when I asked him if Donald Trump had been shot dead by the bullet that clipped his ear just before the Republican convention, who would the Republicans have nominated? He thought that in that context, they would have nominated Donald Trump Jr.
I'd like to ask the panel what influence, if any, policymakers would have when addressing the alignment problem for advanced artificial intelligence models.
What influence policymakers would have?
Correct.
Relative to the people who are building the technology?
Correct.
And is the implication of your question, what influence, if any?
I think there is a real opportunity. This is just open space now. The AI weapons dialogue has given me some insight to the way that you can create norms between the US and China on technology. And I think there is a real missed opportunity in not having more open discussion around this norm building and focusing only on the competition and the battle. And I think it would be great if more policymakers had more influence rather than just ceding it to technologists.
I don't take seriously the idea that AI is a threat to humanity. Only to the extent that it can be used by human beings, that it can be used by states, that it can be used by superpowers as a form of control or as a form of warfare. But I do believe that this idea that AI can become an enemy of humanity is essentially a kind of hype that is being created by the people that need to convince us that it's a superintelligence. You know, it's a big philosophical, long discussion. AI doesn't have a will. Even if we create a superintelligence, it doesn't have a will. The will be provided by human beings. As you can read in Dune, the book, it's not in the movie, there's a sentence there that is kind of a striking and disturbing sentence. Looking back, because there was an AI in Dune, it says, you know, at one point, human beings created intelligent machines in order to control other human beings. And that's how I think about AI, is a tool of control by human beings over other human beings, but not a threat to humanity.
And my view about this in relation to that is that we've long lived in a world where we built artificial entities that have the power to destroy us. And we've spent this evening talking about those entities, and it's not AI, it's states and corporations. Mm-hmm. States and corporations are not human. Even Meta, even those, and I can say this, even those corporations that are under the control of individual human beings and are identified with individual human beings are not human. There is something inhuman about them. And for me, the really scary thought, and I think Sarah's touched on this, is what happens when the power of this technology intersects not with human beings, with all of their foibles and stupidities, but with these other inhuman things that we have built. It's the integration of AI technology and the corporate mentality, which is something which has a will but does not have a conscience. That's the thing that I'm most scared of. A reminder, the name of Bruno Maçães' book is World Builders, and the name of Sarah Wynn-Williams' book is Careless People. Also a reminder that we have a new episode out now on PPF+. It is part 2 of my Q&A with David Klemperer, in which David and I answer some of your many, many excellent questions about our Fixing Democracy series. If you would like to get that episode and all of our bonus episodes, of which there are now a lot, plus all of our future bonuses and ad-free listening, do please sign up to PPF+. It's £5 a month or £50 a year. We really value your support, and it's very easy. Just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, where you'll also be able to see all of the bonus episodes that will be available to you instantly as soon as you sign up. The fourth film in our autumn film series at the Regent Street Cinema in London is happening next week, next Wednesday, on Bonfire Night, if people still call it that. Remember, the 5th of November, and come and see a screening of Derek Jarman's amazing film about the life of Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's not nearly as heavy as you might think. And then a conversation between me and the philosopher and writer Nikhil Krishnan about the film and about Wittgenstein as well. We would love to see you there. To get tickets, you know the drill. Click on the link, go to our website. See you next Wednesday. Next time, in our regular slot, we are resuming a short series, which is part of our much longer series, Politics on Trial, and we're picking up the story of the most interesting trials in history 100 years ago, with what was definitively the trial of the 20th century, an absolute blockbuster and the one that has been most requested by listeners that we cover. Next time, it's Scope's Monkey. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.